Hi, it's your scary fairy godmother. Before we venture into the fairy world together, I'd like to take a moment to thank all my supporters on Patreon and all those who have joined the channel or made a one-off donation. Your support helps enormously and will ultimately help me to make more and better videos more often. If you like this content and would like to become a monthly supporter, head over to my Patreon page at patreon.com/scaryfairygodmother. Or become an official channel member by clicking the join button under this video for only 99 cents. Links for support options can be found in the description. Thank you so much. Now, follow me into the fairy world. This happened when I was around 20. We were moving from Canberra to Queensland. The journey was a 3-day-long drive, and on the second day, after the sunset, we were driving along a country road when something caught my eye. It was what I can only describe as a parade of beings. There were a multitude of them, riding on what I think were horses. But if I started to look at them, they looked more terrifying. And even when I was only watching them from the corner of my eye, they looked like they had all been drowned. The riders were holding lanterns and there were people dancing. What really caught my attention was that the riders were galloping, keeping pace almost with our car. And the beings surrounding the riders and steeds were keeping up as well, despite not having any horses. I've never seen anything like it before, and to be honest, I never want to see anything like it again. Neither my brother nor my mother saw these beings, so I started to think I was imagining them. I was pretty tired. I kept watch for what felt like a long time before we had to pull into a rest stop. The stop was just before a town. But instead of riding through the town like anything my mind would have conjured, this parade veered further into the bush. That's Australian for forest. That night, I didn't really sleep. On and off, I kept hearing snippets of haunting music and voices talking and laughing. At first, I thought there was some sort of gathering going on in one of the other rooms, though the music and the voices had a distant quality, and there was just something off about it. Eventually, I heard voices calling my name and goading me to come outside. That's when I knew for sure these weren't the voices of normal people staying at the inn. It was something else. I didn't go outside. I didn't even get out of bed. It's been years since that incident, and I still think of it often. I can't explain what happened, but since I was the only one to have experienced anything unusual that night, I do wonder if it was all my imagination. But it felt so real. And it was a one-time experience, not something that has happened to me frequently. And for that, I'm grateful. It's not the kind of thing I would like to experience more than once. My instincts tell me if it happened again, the voices that beckoned me outside might not give up so easily. This happened in 2003 or 2004 in Massachusetts. I was 13 or 14 at the time. My mother, 11 or 12-year-old sister, 2 friends about our age, and I all saw this. It was a summer night, the summer solstice to be exact. I remember that detail. We were feeling restless, so we begged my mom to take us to the town beach. The town beach is secluded. It's in a very woodsy area. There's a small parking lot and then a dirt road that goes into the woods. I don't think it goes anywhere, and a set of stairs that leads down to the beach. I'd estimate that there's an elevation of maybe 30 feet from the beach to the road. It was late in the evening. The five of us were the only ones there. The beach closes at sunset, and we weren't really supposed to be there. We were hanging out on the sand when I heard my mom and one of my friends talking excitedly. They kept pointing at something up the dirt road. I looked up and saw these lights, like glowing orbs the size of a fist. I remember thinking they were fireflies at first, but they were way too big, and they didn't blink on and off. They weren't flashlights either. They were too dim for that. And although it was dark, I'm confident we would have seen and heard the people holding them. They floated a couple of feet off the ground like disembodied flames, or the flames of invisible lamps or lanterns, and moved in a soft bob. We watched them completely baffled as to what they could be, and then they floated off into the woods and out of sight. We started discussing what we had seen immediately. All of us saw the lights, and the word fairies was instantly used to describe them. I don't know why. The other people with me were not believers, but that's the word we use to this day when we talk about what happened. We left shortly after. Some of us were spooked, but I remember being really pleased by the sight. As a teenager, I spent a lot of time walking around at night hoping for another experience like it, but I never again saw lights like those. I can't say for sure what we saw, if they were fairies or not, but I got the distinct impression that the lights didn't have anything to do with us, that they were going about their own business. We just happened to see them. I swear this story is entirely true. All five of us witnessed the floating lights, and I do believe they were fairies. I'm not someone who has had many supernatural experiences in my life. It's not something I put a lot of thought into. But I do have an unusually vivid memory of one experience I had when I was a child. It happened in Spain. I was around 10 at the time. It was a warm midsummer evening, and a friend of mine and I were walking through an open field. Not far away, we noticed a bonfire and assumed some local people were camping or having a party. But strangely, we didn't see any people around, only the bonfire. As we got closer, we started to notice balls of light dancing around the bonfire. They were too large to be bugs and were moving in a way I can only describe as synchronized, like a circular dance, round and round the fire. My friend and I both clearly saw these balls of light and watched them in stunned silence. We decided to try to move closer to get a better look and figure out exactly what we were seeing, but as we neared the fire, the lights just disappeared. Looking back, I think what we might have seen were fairies, because it was midsummer evening and it's known that if fairies are seen, it's more often on that night. They were just balls of light. I tried to get a better look to see if there were beings inside the lights or if the lights were held by beings that were hard to see, but I couldn't tell one way or the other. I should say, despite this being my only experience like this, I do believe fairies exist. This happened in 2011 in the summer on several nights of one week, not sure of the month now. At that time, I had been having trouble going to sleep. We slept with the windows open, and I would often sleep with my head at the foot of the bed so I could see out into the backyard and the woods beyond, just so I would have something to look at while I was lying there. One night, after I'd fallen asleep, I woke suddenly, feeling extremely peaceful, and glanced out the window. There I saw a bright whitish light that changed in color as it moved to a sort of indigo violet. It was moving, buzzing around so fast that the light had tracers. I cleared my eyes to make sure I was seeing what I was seeing, and when I looked again, I saw it zip off without a trace. Over the next few nights, I noticed an unusual calmness. A quiet had fallen over the area. None of the animals or birds were making their usual noises. I couldn't even hear any bugs or frogs, and I live out in the country near a heavily wooded area. I started to notice colorful lights throughout the trees of the woods behind my house. These were not fireflies. They were too big and the wrong colors. Fireflies usually glow green, yellow, or orange, but these glowed in many more colors, including blue and indigo. And they didn't behave as fireflies usually do. I could see them very clearly. The closest were about 250 feet from my window and were the size and brightness of old-time Christmas light bulbs. There were about two of them per tree, and they were very high up in the branches. Both the woods on my property and my neighbor's property had them in the trees. They sort of faded bright to dark constantly and would switch between a variety of colors. I took out a flashlight and shone it at the lights, sweeping the beam across the trees. As soon as the light from my flashlight hit the lights, they vanished. But they reappeared instantly when I turned the flashlight off. I had no idea what these things were. The next night, I noticed the property next to mine had glittery rings about 30 feet in diameter across its field. The rings glistened like light shining on diamonds. I wanted to figure out what was causing this phenomenon, so I went out to investigate. But when I got close to the rings, the glistening faded and vanished, and I could find nothing obvious making the apparition. After about a week, the lights in the trees went away, but I continued to see the glistening rings occasionally for many months after. I tried to get other people to notice them, but no one ever admitted to seeing them, and eventually they stopped appearing altogether. I have no rational explanation for these lights. I think fairy activity could be one explanation. It certainly gets my imagination going. If those were fairies out there, what were they doing? Meeting, dancing, celebrating? I don't know. And I don't know why they chose the area where I live, however briefly, to engage in their revels. When I was a child, I got a strong sense that there were creatures living in our garden other than the usual birds and insects. When I played outside during twilight or as it was getting dark, I would frequently see movement in the grass or among the trees, and sometimes I would hear light, upbeat, almost medieval sounding music, like a flute and lyre maybe. A few times I actually saw very tiny beings in the garden, carrying small, very bright lamps. They were wispy and long-haired, quite ghostly, almost transparent in form, though not quite opaque, very pale. As I recall, they were almost like unkempt children with long hair and clothing that was light, shimmery, but rippled and torn in layers, and they had bare feet. I was easily scared as a child and had phobias of many things, but I never felt scared of these creatures in the garden. although I did feel nervous about getting too close, in case one day they wanted me to go away with them. I frequently looked for them during the day, but never saw any, although I used to imagine that any scattering of flowers or leaves around the garden was them. Now, I did know about fairies as a child and loved them. I used to read the Narnia stories, the faraway tree, etc. I even used to try and call them up when I was a kid, half scared that what I was doing was real magic, and they would come, and half disappointed when they didn't. But I always thought there was a chance they might, so I guess I just believed really strongly in them. I'm entirely open to the idea that I loved and believed in fairies so much that I conjured them up really vividly in my own imagination. But the memories are just so real and vivid. And if it was just my imagination, why didn't I imagine them appearing all those times I tried to call them? The few times I did catch a glimpse of them were rare and felt accidental, not something I wanted or had done on purpose. And when I saw them, I just knew straight away what they were. I think fairies are natural beings that are made up of energy, or maybe the echoes of previous generations of the land. I think they are probably guardians of the natural world. This happened in the 1960s in West Virginia. I was camping with a friend. It might have been around 10 o'clock p.m. We were sitting around a fire and we heard footsteps nearby, like someone was walking through the woods. We were alone and deep in the bush, in a spot where it would be unusual to see other people, even campers, but not impossible. We got up and used our flashlights to scan around the area, thinking it might have been an animal of some kind, but we saw nothing. Heading back to camp, my friend saw a floating orb light. It looked like a lantern floating through the air. We camped in these woods several nights, and in that time, we both saw these floating lights like lanterns moving through the trees. Along with the lights, there was always the sound of footsteps through the leaves. A couple of times we heard what sounded like the voice of a small child. But whenever we searched around, we found no sign of anyone in the area other than ourselves. We actually never saw anything that looked like a fairy or anything else. But from the descriptions, from books I've read, it could have been a possibility. I can't say that what was wandering through the woods those nights were fairies for sure, just that it was a new experience seeing the orbs the few nights that we were there. The house that I grew up in was believed to be haunted with ghosts. And growing up through my childhood into manhood, I have experienced a number of things that I couldn't explain. The experiences that I had in the woods were different from those experiences. So I think fairies could be a possibility, but no proof of it. It could have been something else. I don't know for sure. Me and a friend, aged 19 and 17 respectively, had been hitchhiking through England on our way home for 2 days in May 1983. We hadn't slept either night, and by the second night, we were completely exhausted. We were often unable to get a lift and ended up walking for long distances at a time. Eventually, we both started hallucinating from sheer exhaustion, seeing shapes and figures in trees, but sort of knowing they weren't real. As we kept pushing ourselves forward, the imagery got stronger and stronger. At some point, we weren't sure which way to go when this Victorian lady appeared along the side of the road. and pointed us in a direction down a lane which led to a toll bridge crossing the River Avon. This was about 4 in the morning, and the Victorian lady turned out to actually be a wastebasket and signpost with a lamp above. This is when the hallucinatory experience stepped up a notch. As we walked down the hill towards the bridge, we became aware that a large party was going on. As we neared the bridge, we could see fairies and elves in the midst of a celebration of some kind, and we could hear beautiful music. There's a weir under the bridge, but the party seemed to be almost floating above the water. And as we walked onto the bridge, we seemed to have walked right into the middle of it all. The participants were quite indifferent to us, I felt, in the way that we would be indifferent to cattle that might look at us from over a hedge. We both sat down on a bench and just gazed around in amazement. There were a couple that I became engrossed in, a fairy and an elf sitting in the forks of some plant like a foxglove or something like that. They were drinking out of very delicate flower-shaped glasses and looked at me almost malevolently, but were ultimately too engrossed with their party to bother with us. They both had a very childlike quality due to their size, I suppose, which was between 6 and 12 inches, but very hard to judge. And their skin was quite leathery, which gave them a very ancient quality. Both dressed very delicately. The fairy had very fine wings, like daddy long legs. I wanted to stay and observe them, but my friend was very nervous and kept telling me to come along. So we walked off. Just down the road, we sat in a pub garden overlooking a graveyard where we talked about what we had just seen. But soon we were both overcome with more strange hallucinations that frightened us both, but had nothing to do with fairies or parties. These hallucinations continued for the next hour or two through dawn. There seemed to be a very obvious difference between the hallucinations and the fairy party, though. The hallucinations seemed like a mind trick, and though they frightened us, we knew they weren't real. We were sure of it. On the other hand, the fairies on the bridge had seemed an otherworldly or extra dimensional experience, almost seen through a fisheye lens, as the sizes of things could not be well discerned. 30 years later, I revisited the place where we had seen the fairy party during the day to try and regain a sense of it all. I got a pint from a local pub and went to sit on the same bench me and my friend had sat on that night. As I got to the bench, my feet became twisted around each other very strangely, and I stumbled onto the bench, luckily saving most of my drink. But it was strange. I felt like something had tripped me and was laughing at me. Very, very strange. The memory of that fairy party on the bridge is stronger than most other memories from that time. The experience seems to have really stuck with me for some reason. And I wonder if our altered state of consciousness, while causing hallucinations on the one hand, might have also enabled us to see something real. Something that exists but is outside the realm of normal human perception. I was camping with some friends in a forest known as Bluebell Woods, named obviously for its abundance of bluebells. It was very early in the morning before dawn. I woke up and went outside my tent to take in the morning air. It was perfectly quiet, like dead silent, which was strange in itself, but I didn't have much time to think about it. I was distracted by many little lights, maybe like 75 to 100, that appeared out of a sea of bluebells. The flowers were in full bloom at the time. They looked like fireflies, but their lights were the same blue-purple shade as the bluebells. They flew around for a few minutes, forming the most beautiful shapes. Two of my friends poked their heads out of their tents and saw exactly what I was seeing. The lights flew up into the trees, never really coming close to us, maybe about 25 meters away. They started to disperse after a couple of minutes, just as it was getting lighter. Before they fully disappeared, those that remained came into one last cluster and formed a humanoid shape that seemed to turn its head and look at us. It was only for a second, but it seemed like these little lights were intelligent and were putting on a show just for us. Then the little lights flew back into the bluebells and vanished. After the sun had risen and it was light, we looked around in the bluebells for any evidence of what might have caused these lights, but found nothing unusual. I think the lights were fairies because this experience fits with other descriptions of fairies I have heard of in the past. I was staying at my parents' home on a small island in New Hampshire. I woke up around 4 a.m. This was not unusual, unfortunately, because I have very irregular sleep patterns. What was different this time was I felt a kind of inner pull or compulsion to get up, walk into the bathroom, raise the shade, and look out the window. Now, normally, I hate having the shades up when it's dark outside. It's a pet peeve of mine. When the shades are up at night, I feel like I'm exposed to the outside world in a display case. So I always keep them down and very rarely raise them unless there's a good reason to. But on this night, for no reason I can explain rationally, I raised the shade and looked out into the darkness. Across the country road, a fair distance away, I saw floating multicolored lights, varying in size. They appeared to be dancing. They were moving in circles in the pitch darkness, dancing high over the trees and low between the branches. They were beautiful and compelling. I felt mesmerized by them. Still, there was something sinister that gave me pause. I can't explain this because there was nothing inherently frightening in this display. It was mysterious and inexplicable, but not frightening. Despite these reservations, I started to feel compelled, drawn almost irresistibly outside. An intense feeling of longing came over me, and I wanted so badly to be close to those lights. I wasn't worried about what was casting those lights. I wasn't worried about what might be out there in the dark. There was a feeling of almost apathy for my personal safety. But fortunately, I was able to stop myself from running outside in my pajamas and following the lights into the dark woods, and then who knows where. But I couldn't take my eyes off them. I watched them until the sun came up, the whole time fighting this urge to leave everything behind and follow the lights. When the sun came up, the lights slowly dissipated and faded, and so did the compulsion I felt to be near them. On a side note, there is a strange belief on my mother's Irish side of the family that there is she in our blood. I don't think this has any currency, though it felt relevant because whenever I think about what was out there that night, drawing me into the darkness, the only word that comes into my head is fairies. I occasionally experience mild bouts of insomnia. One night, very late when I couldn't sleep, I was sitting by my bedroom window and gazing out at the dark, empty street below, just lost in my thoughts. Soon, I started to notice movement coming from the wooded area on the other side of my street. This area has never been developed before, but was purchased and due to be built upon soon by a construction company. As I stared into the dark woods, I noticed people of normal adult height emerging from the trees in a kind of procession, two by two, onto the street. They wore long white cloaks that swished against the road, with hoods pulled up to obscure their features. Each person held a single lit candlestick in front of them. One walked alone in front of the others. The rest walked in two straight columns. They appeared to be moving from the wooded area to an old cemetery on the other end of the street. Though they were human-sized and very solid-looking, I just felt instinctually that they weren't human. They moved in silence. I was on the second floor and my window was open. I normally can hear people talking or walking down on the street, especially at night when everything is quieter. But I heard nothing at all from these people. No voices, no footsteps, nothing. Just perfect silence. I froze where I was and just watched them, hardly daring to even breathe, partly in fear that they would see or hear me, partly in awe of what I was seeing. It was some long minutes before the processional passed completely out of my view. At the time, I didn't understand what I was witnessing. But after research and talking to others who had experienced paranormal sightings, it seems very likely that what I saw was fairies. I now believe that this was a fairy mound, moving because the wooded area was due to be built upon, and this was some kind of ritual that they performed for their new location. I think fairies are creatures that we don't have a good understanding of, ancient magical folk that live in nature and sometimes have to move through the mortal plane. Thanks for watching, and welcome to all the new subscribers recently. It's been really gratifying to watch the channel grow. For those who are new, if you have a fairy story to share, I'd love to read it. My email is in the description. I also love hearing how these videos inspire your creative work. So if you have artwork or short stories or just anything creative that's very related that you'd like to share, please send it to me and I'll share it on my social media channels. And remember to put fairy art in the subject line. I really hope you enjoyed these stories. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and if you have any requests for themes or for future videos or just any comments or questions, I'll be in the comments responding for the next hour or so. As always, extra special thanks goes out to all my supporters on Patreon and all those who join the channel as members. Thank you guys so much for the support. If you like this content and would like to support it, please check out my Patreon page. The link is in the description, or you can join the channel for just 99 cents by clicking the join button below. The stories in the video came courtesy of subscribers and the Fairy Census. Thanks to everyone who submitted. As always, some of the stories from the census were edited to make them more friendly for narration, but if you want to read the originals, the link to the census is in the description. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe if you're new, and hit the bell to receive notifications of new videos. And until next time, this has been a visit from your scary fairy godmother.